So something that really made my brain hurt is that the quote is, happiness was linked to being a taker rather than a giver, whereas meaningfulness went more with being a giver than a taker. Higher levels of worry and stress and anxiety were linked to more meaningfulness and less happiness. So how can two intrinsically linked states of being be so hard to attain simultaneously? Is it one or the other? Can one be happy without meaning and vice versa? And this is specifically very important to me. I'm a parent, and there's that parental paradox where parents who spend more time with children have more meaning but are less happy. I can't compute this, so can you give me the answer?
Okay, so basically this is a chapter in the book about happiness, which is a subject people are very interested in and concerned about. And we can't go into it in too much detail because it's a big subject. But first of all, one of the points I make is people don't really define happiness properly. And like going back to the point I made about therapists need to help you label what's going on inside your head correctly. So the label happiness is bandied around, but what exactly does the word mean? And one of the key points I make in the book is actually there's more than one kind of happiness. So anyone who starts talking to you about happiness but doesn't define the term properly, again, close the door quietly and walk away. We won't go into the definition of happiness right now, but the research indicates there's two kinds of people in life who are pursuing and sometimes getting close to, but never getting quite to happiness. One is people who are pursuing the meaningful life, and the other are people who are pursuing the happy life. The meaningful life is you notice things are not right around you. It could be locally things are not right around you, like your trains don't run on time, or your therapist isn't very good, or the local health service isn't very good, or your local school is not very good at teaching your children. Listen, the world is full of faults, things that don't work right, okay? You notice something that's quite important to you that isn't working right around you, and you decide to do something about it. So you talk to the headmaster who's in charge of the school that's teaching your children. You say, the education you're providing is lamentable and we need to fix it. The people who are pursuing the meaningful life are trying to fix things that are wrong around them. And as a result, they enter into conflict with people and they have quite stressful lives. But because they fix things and they campaign and the school does improve sometimes, they then become slightly happier as a result of the school improving. The meaningful life inevitably leads you into quite stressful situations. You tend to be argumentative at parties. People say, something, and then you think what they said isn't quite right. You argue with them. You're a difficult person. You're argumentative, and you're not happy when the train doesn't run on time. You write a letter of complaint. That is the meaningful life, and we need people who pursue the meaningful life because they find cures for cancer and they find vaccines.
And these are the successful people that you deal with who are stressed and worried, and these are the people that make things, and the happy people.
There's people who are pursuing happiness, which says, I notice that if I was to complain to my headmaster who's teaching my kids that the school's terrible, that's not going to go very well and it's going to be full of conflict. So I'll just be quiet at the parent-teachers meeting and I'll just be passive. And instead, I'll go home and watch Netflix. And that will be happiness. And there is a sense in which there is a secret to happiness there, which is turn a blind eye to problems and instead just take stuff that cheers you up. It could be Netflix, it could be Prozac, it could be heroin, okay? There's a tendency to notice conflict but avoid it. There is a deep truth there that if you keep pursuing conflict with people, you won't end up being very happy. So the point I'm trying to make is you need to make some tough choices. You can't say, I want to be happy, and at the same time say, the fact that my kids are having a poor education is making me unhappy. The deeper question is what will make us happy and what makes us unhappy. And if you want to pursue meaning in life, then it does mean you're going to enter into conflict with the world, but you also need to be able to survive the world. And I'm saying I don't necessarily have the answer for everyone, but each individual has to work out an answer for themselves that makes sense. In other words, you have to know the limits to the meaningful life for you. It's for you to decide. Some people who are political activists devote their lives to the meaningful life. And they get imprisoned, and they think that's okay, because as far as they're concerned, they're trying to change the world. If you don't want to get imprisoned for a political cause, and instead you want to watch a certain amount of Netflix and play a certain amount of tennis and have your kids educated, then you're going to have to make some sacrifices on the meaningful life front, and instead pursue a certain amount of hedonism, a certain amount of passivity in the face of life's difficulties. It's for you to decide where to set the thermometer, as it were, on that point. And that's the key point I'm trying to make in terms of some of the answers or challenges people have to confront if they want happiness. There is a tension between the happy life and the meaningful life.
And it's a matter of balance and acceptance, in a way.
Yes. What is the right balance for you, personality-wise, given your personality? That's the key point.
Okay.
So there is no one size fits all. It's you understanding yourself. For example, why did I write the book? It was quite stressful writing the book. It meant during the lockdown, instead of doing other things I could have done, which might have been slightly more fun, I engaged in the meaningful life, and I produced a book because I saw around me a lot of problems. I thought the advice, the mental health advice that was coming through the media was terrible. Okay, I could have just been passive and just accepted that, but I decided to sit down and write a book that challenge it and provoke it. And to some extent, that led to a lot of stress with the editors, a lot of stress with the publishers, etc., etc., etc. But to me, I'm doing something meaningful. Writing a book isn't necessarily the answer for everyone, and you will take a hit on the happiness front while you're pursuing the meaningful life. But again, it's for you to decide in terms of what fits your personality. That's the point I'm making.
Okay. Well, your book terrified me by the end, but that's possibly because I'm more easily terrified than your average person. I felt you did allude to Camus and the plague, and I haven't read it, but I assume it's a bad ending.
Well, you're right, actually. That's a very insightful point. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that reading Camus does make you feel suicidal, and he does confront suicide as one of the central questions in life. So Camus is deeply pessimistic about the idea that life is a problem that can be solved. My book is, as an antidote to Camus, hugely more optimistic about that. In fact, Camus says that part of the reason why the plague represents a problem is the plague comes along as actually in a deep sense, an unsolvable problem. But what we do is we switch on the TV at night and our politicians say, we're solving the problem, relax, we'll do a lockdown, that will solve the problem, and we'll throw money at vaccines, and this will solve the problem. Our politicians are constantly telling us life is a solvable problem. Camus says, to some extent, we're seduced by that. Life is not an entirely solvable problem. Bad things will happen to us, and there's not actually a huge amount we can do about some of that. And Camus' view is some acceptance of that point is actually being a little bit more in touch with reality. Remember, Camus' position is also that life is fundamentally absurd. It's not just that it makes no sense, because he doesn't believe in God. There is no hidden meaning. It's worse than that. It's actually absurd. Good people will die early, bad things will happen to good people, bad people will do well, as often happened in the pandemic. There's a huge amount of scamming going on, and a lot of people made a lot of money. It wasn't just the virus that made a killing.
No. What the take home, which again, maybe it was my stance on life, is that the mental vaccine is so important because the emotional toll, the after effects will emotionally and mentally will far exceed the health impact of COVID for the future. And this is, we're talking about, you alluded to you referenced the Spanish flu and how generations suffered psychologically from that, and how in utero the babies will feel the stress of their mothers in lockdown, and that will have an impact on their mental health. Is there anything that we can do to mitigate this terrible kind of disastrous outcome?
Well, that's a very important point, and the book is a bit frightening at the end, because the point I'm trying to make is a lot of people think the pandemic is over, but it's not over. And there's some research I quote in the book that showed that many generations after the Spanish flu, which was in around 1919, 1920, 3 or 4 generations after that, there was still a psychological impact that was measurable. So that's a pretty interesting and frightening idea, that this is a pandemic that's going to have an emotional and psychological impact for generations to come. And our politicians have a nasty tendency to want to reassure us and say, we'll throw more therapists at the problem and it'll all be okay relatively quickly. The other problem is, I don't care how many therapists they throw at the problem, it will be impossible for therapists, an army of therapists, to tackle the mental health impact of the pandemic. Hence the book, which is a self-help guide, how people can help themselves, is a very important idea, because the idea that we'll just wait for more therapists to be trained and thrown at us and that will solve the problem is fundamentally flawed, I think. Towards the end of the book, there is a chapter where I discuss Freud's response, because a lot of people don't realize that Sigmund Freud lost a daughter to Spanish flu. And it's slightly puzzling as to whether, and there's a debate about whether that had an impact, given he lived through it. And he was quite right slap bang in the middle of his career. He died in 1939. The pandemic was in 1919, 1920, around that time, and he lost a daughter to it. How come it doesn't really occur much more in his writings? And actually, I think one of the most poignant things that Freud ever said was not in his books, but in a letter he wrote to a friend of his, because the friend had a son that died, and Freud is comforting him. And it's very interesting, because in a way Freud steps outside of being the professional therapist. He's talking to a friend, and what he says is very moving. Again, I don't want to spoil it, but about the notion, actually, that to some extent suffering in life is inevitable, but also the grief is a price we pay for love. So I thought it was very wise and moving words, he says, which again is quite an important idea or antidote to a lot of the terrible, very trite, superficial psychological advice that's offered during this pandemic.
I have the quote here, which I shan't read.
You can read it if you want to.
It's beautiful. I wrote it down because it was so... Freud is, I mean, one of the things he wrote is, I found little that is good about human beings on the whole. In my experience, most are trash. Yet he was a kind and tolerant person, and interestingly, he didn't believe that any scientific advances of neuroscience would alleviate human suffering. It's really just about us understanding ourselves and whatnot.
And relationships. He thought the answer would be with our relationship with ourselves and with other people. And there's a deep truth there. I mean, I'm not a big fan of a lot of things that Freud said, but that idea that the answer doesn't lie in neuroscience or in chemistry or in a deeper understanding of the brain is a very important idea, because he anticipated, 100 years before now, basically, that all the advances that are supposedly happening in neuroscience don't really seem to be benefiting patients at the end of it. And that's a big, again, problem the therapy industry is not directly confronting and saying. It's true. There are massive advances in our understanding of molecular biology that are leading to definite improvements in cancer treatment. Okay? What's going on? Why is there this gap between the fact there's scientific advances occurring in the way we understand how the brain works, just as much as there's scientific advances in understanding how cells work, which explains why there are fantastic new treatments for cancer? Where are the treatments for mental illness that should be arising out of the neuroscience breakthroughs that are happening every week? They're not happening. And it's, again, something the therapy world doesn't want to say. And Freud explained why it's never going to happen, to some extent. And it's really because you're looking in the wrong place for the problem. The problem is in our relationship with ourselves and in our relationship with others.
Can I just read out this quote? It's beautiful. It almost made me cry, but I can't cry, but it almost did. My daughter who died would have been 36 today. We know that the acute sorrow we feel after such a loss will run its course, but also that we will remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may come to take its place, even should it fill that place completely, it remains something else. And that's how it should be. It's the only way of perpetuating a love that we do not want to abandon.
Very moving. And what is he saying? He's saying, I can't, in a sense, he's being consoling, but he's also saying, you will be inconsolable. And there's something very beautiful and paradoxical about that, his acknowledgement of this massive loss. He's not trying to fill it with some trite words. He's saying, yes, this is big and it's massive and it's horrible, but I'm your friend. Just very, very beautiful stuff. And that is one of the problems with the pandemic. Where was the community involvement. We were living in streets where we knew our neighbours or the neighbours down from us might be in trouble. Did people rally round? Were people friends to each other in the fullest sense of that word? Now, I've had the conversations with lots of people about this, and there's a big debate. Some people said, yes, my street did rally round. They thought people were supportive. I'm not so sure. I think that people turn to governments and food banks and institutional solutions, but the pandemic illuminated something that there's a limit to what governments can do, and we need to look after each other. And I think the pandemic illuminated that underlying problem, which is what Camus said about his book, The Plague. The Plague actually reveals deeper underlying problems that were there all along, that were festering. We were ill before the plague came along. That's what Camus is saying.
And, well, thank you so much for being here. This was me jumping in to this world of YouTube and interviews with you. So jumping in the deep end, which I think you would be, you would recommend, you would prescribe. And thank you for allowing this to happen. Your book is really something that surprised me, and there are so many things I didn't really, so many chapters which I couldn't imagine would have tied into COVID, but do, and just generally really interesting. I'm not trying to sell your book for you, I'm just trying to be kind. You do have another one coming out about the NHS, which I would love to talk to you about. I have lots of personal experience with the NHS, the mental health services and whatnot. Yeah, it was, thank you so much for your time. And the book is now out, The Mental Vaccine for COVID-19 for everyone. I do recommend it wholeheartedly. I'm not a big reader, but I read that through in a night almost. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you soon at some point. Maybe talk about your NHS book and
Great.
whatnot.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
You're welcome.